technical things, yell at me.
Perfect. I will. Thank you so much. All right, our students are coming in now.
Do we usually go around the room? Is that, or does that take up too much time?
So we usually have our students introduce themselves in the chat box if they'd like to connect with you. And then sometimes they ask questions live. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to TeleShadowing. We are live on YouTube. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box as we go along and they'll be addressed. If you're interested in interacting with Dr. Kessel, feel free to have your cameras on. I'm honored to introduce our mentor for today, Dr. Kessel. Dr. Kessel is a retired Assistant Surgeon General for the Commissioned Corps of the U.S. Public Health Service. He's a senior scholar and a professor of pediatrics at the Koop Institute of the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth College. Dr. Kessel also serves as a professor of the practice of family medicine in the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland. Now I'd like to request Dr. Kessel to begin today's session. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for getting up so early in the morning. But because I see virtually none of you live, it must mean you're all in pajamas, eating breakfast, drinking coffee. Hard to know what else you're doing, but hopefully not driving a vehicle. But anyway, thank you again, and it's a pleasure. You know, the first thing I want to say is point to my T-shirt. This is Wear Orange Weekend, and orange has become a symbol, the color of the concern of the national epidemic of gun violence in this country. And just to begin with that, there's, you know, so many tragic events going on in the world and locally and all over, but it turns out that and it's not just the mass shootings that gain the headlines. Certainly those, you know, being a pediatrician with children being murdered by military style weapons is just untenable for me. I mean, I started this process some 50 years ago when I was in the South Bronx. We'll talk about all of that. And but 120 some odd people die every day from, on average, from gun violence, whether it's homicide, suicide, or unintentional injury, even tragically police action, all related to it. So anyway, that's the Wear Orange Weekend. Just to, I don't think you need much reminder, but it's just sort of painful. Anyway, to begin again, you know, thank you. I'm going to see if I can operate these slides, and probably, can you see my cursor moving around on the slide?
Yes, we do.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, you know, this is the simple version. I began my college education and graduated as an electrical engineer. And we'll talk a little bit about how I went from that to sort of where I am. But these 3 degrees sort of summarize my career odyssey. And if there's questions or issues or, you know, interrupt me. And we'll sort of go forward from here. Born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a little north of here, the first capital of the United States, and lots of interesting things, but not the least of which is the home of cheesesteaks and hoagies. Important to me, although I may have had some medical consequences by overindulging when I was a whole lot younger. But as I, you know, alluded to earlier, went to college as an engineer. Why? My dad was an engineer. I mean, it was sort of the unique thing about Drexel in those days. It had what's called a co-op program. Co-op program, lots of very classic names for things, but it was a 5-year program, and it was a means to enable me to pay for my education, because you got paid. Wasn't quote internships. They literally, I worked for the Philadelphia Electric Company and did some research during that period of time. And it was a very formative period for me. But, it's interesting. Back then it was designed to help students pay for college. And now it's sort of the in vogue, how do we get field experience, community experience? But I guess the one thing I will tell you is, it's Saturday morning, so I usually sort of call on people. But I may or may not forego that. But one of my co-op periods was I worked in a bioengineering lab. And it was the result of doing this bioengineering that redirected my electrical engineering focus more toward the medical side of things. And parenthetically, I'm part of the University of Maryland has an absolutely first-class bioengineering program, part of the obvious outstanding engineering school, and it's so I'm still part of that. But I worked on a project called chronically implantable biotelemetry systems. So normally I would call on somebody and say, well, what do you think the word chronic means? But we'll speed this up a little today. Chronic means over time. The expected notion was to leave them in place. Biotelemetry, now I'm an old character. So this is, 50 plus years ago. Biotelemetry meant wireless. Even hard to believe we had wireless in those days, but, the radio was invented many, many years even before that. So we had wireless transmission. But the key was, and I was, a student, I didn't, knew some of the engineering, but I basically manufactured these little devices under a microscope using discrete components, little soldering iron, little this, made the boards. The whole goal was to implant these into monkeys and attach a temperature and pressure transducer to the uterus. But what was unique was that since these were really tracking reproductive health issues, putting the monkeys back into their own environment with a wireless transmission, there had been tethered meaning there was indwelling catheters, permanent connections. And that has advantages too. You can draw blood at the same time you see signal and whatever. But as it's reproductive health, you don't want this giant umbilical cord connected to all this fancy technology. Anyway, the experiment failed. Now, anybody want to guess why the experiment failed? You're all drinking coffee and semi-awake here. The experiment failed because 50 years ago, the technology to transmit was there, but the battery technology wasn't there. And they were tiny little batteries, that we have every day in our watches. Their liability as a pediatrician. Tragically, kids have swallowed them. I mean, we've tried to, change some of those things, but the batteries failed. They leaked, so they created a peritonitis, an inflammation in the abdominal cavity. But it exposed me to medicine. The other thing that was critical at Drexel is, sounds a little negative, but despite being an engineer, I got involved in some of the social dynamics, the turmoil, the Vietnam War, and issues in the community. Drexel as a university was expanding, took over decaying neighborhoods and displaced people. And, in addition to soldering those devices. I sort of slept in front of a bulldozer that was attempting to raise some condemned housing and to be replaced by Drexel University, University of Pennsylvania. So the whole notion of community housing and challenges that people place were put in place. The seeds of all of that were there. And so as a consequence, like some of you, many of you, I can't see any of you, so you can't raise your hands, but I know at least Minahil is on the journey to medical school. I decided to, I'll go to medical school. So I could pursue, frankly, I still had intention of the biomedical and the clinical realm. And I ended up at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, somewhat very fortunate. I mean, there's no bad medical school in the United States. They're all a little different. And there's no bad medical school in the United States for some interesting reasons, largely regulatory. Every medical school has to have a hospital. Every medical school has to have a laboratory. Every medical school accepts payment from insurance companies and the federal government. So there's a huge amount of regulatory energy that goes into medical school. So interestingly enough, the quality of medical care and is really well established in part by requirements. But if you can see some of these pictures, this is where I spent most of my medical education. I don't know how many of you know the South Bronx, but the South Bronx has more barbed wire per square linear something than any place in the country. It is really a very, even today, and usually I ask, you know, even though I have these pictures in black and white, I usually ask, when do you think they're from? And I purposefully put them in black and white to disorient you. These are not 50-year-old pictures. These are very contemporary pictures. And you know, for me, tragically, it looks like Ukraine. You could look at some of these pictures and Lincoln Hospital has an interesting history. Again, now I see 4 of you live. I could pick on you, but I'm not, because you graciously put on your cameras. But the question would be, why do you think it's named Lincoln Hospital? Named obviously for President Lincoln, and named for President Lincoln because he created this during the Civil War to care for Black soldiers who were discriminated against. You know, we have, you know, racism has never gone away, and it's reappeared in, you know, in intense forms. Maybe reappeared's the wrong word, always here, but we're certainly sensitive to it. But so its history is very much part of the Black and minority culture, and it became a central facility in the South Bronx. The other question I usually ask is how many of you have seen Godfather 1, the movie? And maybe some of you, a few of you, I don't know.
Dr. Kessel, you can ask us questions. We're ready to participate. I've told all the participants.
Oh, all right. Well,
you
participate.
Can ask us. Go ahead, call on us. Yeah.
How many people have seen Godfather 1? Maybe. It's still on TV. Anyway, the reason, you know, when I first saw it, I stood up in the middle of the theater, got a little booed, and clapped, because in Godfather 1, they used the facade of the old Lincoln Hospital for Marlon Brando when he was shot in the restaurant. And I had been there virtually every day for a couple of years. And it's sort of striking that they used this facade built in the 50s, I mean, modified in the 50s. This picture here is certainly built during the Civil War. And that's where I went to medical school. Now, the significance of most of these photos is as I was introduced to medicine as an engineer, I was really introduced to the challenges in the community in the South Bronx. I guess a couple of quick stories, and these were formative. This is the first time I had experienced, you'll see in one of those photos, gun violence in the community. And I took care of a child who was shot by another child. This was unintentional gun violence. And this is, 50 plus years ago. The other two stories of significance is a 17-year-old died holding my hand in the hallway. We had wards in those days. Wards meant there were more or less 50 people, beds, 25 beds on each side of a long hallway, no single rooms. And there were some curtains, but not very much. But the wards were packed and she was in the hallway waiting to be, and she died holding my hand. And she died of a septic abortion in New York City. Septic meaning from an infection, because she had had a non-medically controlled abortion in the back alley in New York City. And the ironies of ironies, it was the only place at that time in the United States where abortion was legal, and yet she had and died holding my hand. And whatever you think of your values as a physician, you certainly value the sanctity of life, but dying of an illegal, legal, unsafe practice, from my perspective, just sort of influenced my whole thinking about that practice. The other one was as a medical student. Normally I would ask a question again here, but these questions, I'll ask them a few later. But I was a medical student in the emergency room in this Lincoln Hospital, and you can imagine Lincoln Hospital was a pretty busy emergency room, and this 18-year-old young woman was brought in something called hypovolemic shock. Hypo means low. Volemic means she had basically lost all of her blood. How did that happen? She had been shot. She had been stabbed from gang violence on the street. She'd been on the wrong side of the street, something or other. The importance here was that I was in the ER with a young surgeon just back from the Vietnam War. He took a blade and opened her chest, and doing what's called internal cardiac massage. We rarely do this. This is really a medical field operation, last ditch, I might add. And he opened her chest and put my hand inside her chest, and I became her life support. And to speed this up, because I got a bunch of stories that along the path, my hand is in her chest, and we're going up to the surgical suite. And we get up to the surgical suite, which in those days had been on the top floor and an old building. And fortunately, the elevator broke down, but somehow or other, and my hand is in her chest. And I'm her life support. The glass starts breaking in the the OR. Bullets started flying. The gang had come in, the police had come in, and there's now a gun battle in the hallway outside of the operating room. Fortunately, unlike what happened in Oklahoma, no one was injured in the medical staff, but the patient died, and fortunately, the police finally took care of that. But I tell you these things because the journey in your career is a collection of experiences, not just advancing your cognitive knowledge, and it changes what you think in your values and raising up to importance. So these happened very early in my career, and I began to have a sense of, do I treat one patient or do I treat a lot of patients? And how do you think about context? How do you think about community? How do you think about applying the miracles of medicine? But to move on, so I finally did graduate, fortunately, medical school. I read a lot of the New York Times in the back. Fortunately, they had a medical section, and that was as good as half of the lectures. And then I went to another urban inner city community in Boston City Hospital, and experienced, some of the same kinds of things. And that's what these, even though these photos are old, this is what the buildings look like. I mean, you couldn't tell that these buildings were, even though it's 50 years old, brand new to me. And Boston was a city in turmoil, struggling with racism. There was incredible school desegregation or segregation. I mean, intense communities. Certainly today you'd think of it as racism, but the intensity of the communities, if you were not of that demography, you didn't go in that community. It was even in some sense more intense than what I experienced in New York, because there were developmental, historical things almost since the Tea Party. So again, I experienced those kinds of the admixture of wanting to learn how to be the best pediatrician I could, clinically take care of children, and a community experience. And I became much more aware of many of the children admitted to the hospital, particularly, for example, asthma, and the severity of their asthma was a function of the housing that they came from, was a function of the particulate matter in the community, was a function of not having ongoing appropriate care management. As much as we tried, the community health centers were burgeoning in those days. The temporal sequence is ever so slightly out of order. I didn't go directly from Boston to Baltimore. I came to Washington on the next slide, and then went to Baltimore. And because of this notion of I consider myself what's called a macro pediatrician, trying to integrate public health, population health, and clinical care. They're a continuum. Along the path, I learned about cultural sensitivity, that there's in the Puerto Rican community in the South Bronx particularly, there's this theory of hot and cold medicine. You have to figure out what a hot disease is, fever being clearly one of them, and you don't treat it with a hot medicine. So you have to figure that out. If you find out why people are not following your advice, it's not because they didn't understand. It's just because culturally it didn't fit. If I told somebody not to take chicken soup as a primary treatment, that would violate some of their cultural backgrounds. But in Baltimore, another urban inner city community, and another community struggling with segregation and certainly violence, but also the housing stock. These pictures are focused on lead paint poisoning. Um, the normal lead level in the human body is, anybody have a guess what the normal lead level is in the human body?
Is it 0?
Zero. Zero. There's no biological, it is simply a toxicant. It is simply a poison in the human body. Even though we tolerate, and we tolerate less and less, it has neurotoxicity in its extreme case, but zero. And one of my colleagues and friends in Flint, Michigan, found that changing the water supply increased the lead in the water. We do things largely, the number one answer to the questions that I usually pose in class, there's two. One is this one, money. And the second one is Benjamin Franklin, just so you know. So those are giving you some clues, but they didn't purposefully change the water supply, to poison people, although they should have been more vigilant and thoughtful about it. But then when they learned about it, that's when the culpability starts, when they didn't respond appropriately. And it was largely all about money. And we still have, probably in some of the homes you're in, there's still lead paint. Not only lead paint, maybe in the homes, but lead pipes supplying all of this. So what did I do then? Then I said, oh my God, treating one patient one at a time in all the facilities I was in, was there a better solution? Was there some way of, the classic metaphor of not learning to resuscitate the children who were in the rivers, drowning and save one at a time, but to quote unquote go upstream. And for me, going upstream, I found that somebody was actually throwing in the children. They would make decisions that were harmful to children. Witness the current debate, on Capitol Hill. Our romance with military style weapons far exceeds our concern for, the argument of the sanctity of life, the unwillingness to even register weapons. We'll get into probably some more of that a little bit. So I decided, I'd come to Washington and see if there was a way to implement bigger macro solutions, bigger solutions. Seat of government. And, this is the classic Capitol. And this is the Hubert Humphrey building. Was a senator from Minnesota and vice president of the United States. And that's where I spent a lot of time. And I also did one day a week at Children's Hospital, so I could keep that medical education, that experience, up to date, and took care of. And I did an interesting program called the Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholar Program, which was a balance. And there's versions of those kinds of things. But this is, again, post-residency. I think it's important for those of you that want to pursue clinical, become the best clinician you can. Caring for people matters, frankly. I'm hoping this is recorded, and you can send this to the dean or President Pines, even more than mastering the methods to analyze complex databases. Connecting with people and crying with them and sharing with them and holding their hand with the successes of life and the miseries of life puts a framework on what you do. And I went to GW to learn public health. And from my experience, I had been exposed to public health throughout my career, but I didn't know the methods. I didn't know the quantitative things. Although as an engineer, we had lots of math and calculus, and I had a good background for it. But the subtle difference and important for some of you in the quantitative, arena. In engineering, you use math because you want the signal to get to the receiver intact. The goal isn't to randomly send it out and see what happens. The goal is to use the techniques of engineering to make sure a quality signal, just like we're doing Zoom. I mean, it's sort of amazing that you're all here. We have classroom Saturday morning and whatever it is. So for me, the engineering took science and applied it to human problem solving. And it's the same thing in public health. Take the basic science, take the science, and solve the problem. Now, some of the problems are not individual problems. Even though we treat many things with antibiotics, the real question is, could you prevent the exposure? I mean, that's the gist of COVID-19 is, up until, a year and a half ago or more, we had no vaccines, we had no treatments. So the real issue was prevention, and that was through mitigation, transmission, stay away, stay home. We're still struggling with that. We can come back to that. This picture is of a 6-year-old. Her name is Avielle Richmond, and she was murdered at Sandy Hook. She was one of the first graders, and I got to know the family. Served on the board, but it's still this ongoing issue of violence in our country and frankly, using effective technology in gun violence. Another one of the questions is, when the Second Amendment was put into the Bill of Rights, optimally, how many rounds do you think a musket could fire? Any guesses from anybody? One's a good guess, but it turns out optimally 3 in a minute. 3. I mean, and that's, putting the ramrod in and putting the gunpowder in and all that business. So 3. How many do you think an unmodified, quote, semi-automatic? I love the word semi-automatic. I don't know what the hell that word means. Guess how many do you think a semi-automatic weapon, the AR-15, used? How many rounds in a minute do you think they can get off? We're going to have stronger coffee here, I think, next time, or some. It's 45. So at the time the Second Amendment was put in place to protect us against largely the government, because that was what the experience was, search and seizure and government intrusion from Europe. How the Second Amendment still applies when we have military grade weapons. And I show this picture because although I never met Avielle, I met and held in my arms her 2 siblings. And the tragedy of gun violence has many, many different layers to it. Her dad, who I was good friends with, I can still feel he took his own life. He died by suicide 2 years ago. And we had worked together. The last part of this is, what am I doing at Dartmouth? Well, because I was connected to all the surgeons general in my career and in the United States Public Health Service, and served as a public health service officer. Dr. Koop invited me to join his institute at Dartmouth, and I'm on the faculty there, and that's where he went when he left the United States Public Health Service. I usually ask, we should have had a collection of questions. One of the questions is, what is the Surgeon General? God forbid I asked who, nobody gets that. Even what is the Surgeon General? It's a rank in the United States Public Health Service that's been around since 1798, and largely the United States Public Health Service, the next question I would ask is what's common between when the United States Public Health Service was formed and today? And the word is quarantine. We used to not let people off the ship until we could be comfortable that they weren't bringing infectious disease into the country. And that's why our uniform, I actually joke that the Navy stole our uniform because, and in fact, some of the parallel ranks, technically my rank is Assistant Surgeon General, not Rear Admiral. That's our equivalent rank. And every one of the uniformed services now has a Surgeon General as well, but the Surgeon General is part of the United States Public Health Service. And so I'm on the faculty at Dartmouth in the School of Medicine, in the Department of Pediatrics, and also and terrifically have been part of the University of Maryland School of Public Health since its inception about over a dozen years or so ago, and have had the wonderful opportunity of meeting, I teach maternal and child health. I teach clearly some public health activities, but probably the most unique experience, not just with the graduate students, we can talk about some of that, but has been with this program called Federal Fellows. And if some of you are still eligible, it's a unique program at the University of Maryland. It's almost like a co-op program for public policy in some ways. There's a didactic component in the fall and sort of field experience in the spring term. And field experience, pre-COVID was you could go work with Manel in the Department of Public Health in Baltimore for the state of Maryland. Those would be part of the activities. And I teach something called public health politics. A little connected to this, but it's not just related to, although it starts with, and we'll go into some of this in the next minute. So, that's an opportunity, but the School of Public Health is growing, and it's been just a terrific set of experiences. I wanted to leave you, don't get too excited, doesn't mean it's over, with some of the things that I don't know, it's presumptuous maybe, but it's wisdom from others that I captured along the path. And probably key among them is from Congressman Lewis about getting into good trouble. I was fortunate enough to meet him, work with him, share conversation with him. And it's just, he suffered so much, not just physically, but emotionally, and withstood, and was such a pioneer, but what a genuine human being, and he maintained humanity. And we would talk about, frankly, gun violence and how absurd that was in this country. And this other little picture, over here that I think some of you can see I'm circling. Any guess as to what this picture represents?
Which picture are you referring to, Dr. Kessel?
This one,
Oh, yes.
Can you tell who this character is in this picture?
Looks familiar.
Yeah, it looks familiar. It's me. And where is it? It's actually in London. And for those of you who've had little or no experience in public health, in 1854, an anesthesiologist observed through mapping that people were dying from drinking the water. We didn't know microbiology in those days. We didn't know, the laboratories weren't, but he did a very sophisticated technique that we're still doing today. He did mapping. Now, it didn't have computers. had to plot everything. But he found that the source of water that people were dying from, this is cholera, was largely from this pump. And the reason I show this, and it's more complicated than that, the way we didn't understand water supplies and what was clean water and rivers and pollution, but I don't know if anybody can tell what's missing from this pump. But this is public health in action. We had the data. We knew where it was coming from. We didn't understand microbiology. But in 1854, he used a wrench to take the pump handle off, to stop the transmission, stop the death, by being proactive, by intervening. So he didn't stop with a publication in public health journals or medical journals that said this is the source of the problem and here's the maps. He did something, ridiculed a little for it, but he did something. This to me, still epitomizes the tension with our current outbreak. Wear masks, don't wear masks, get near people, don't get near people. What do we do? Get immunized, don't get immunized. The rest of these pictures, the principles that I have followed, this comes from this little drawing down here from one of my mentors, Julie Richmond, who was Assistant Secretary for Health and Surgeon General. Everything has to be evidence-based, science-based. You have to start with the science. You have to have a sound, but the science is not adequate. It doesn't speak for itself. It has to be translated into a social strategy. Oops, pressed the wrong damn button. The social strategy talks about, we know the mRNA vaccines work, but you've got to get them into the arms of people for it to really work. And if we have vaccine hesitancy, or we're not comfortable, or there's something along the path that the confidence isn't there, or we don't have the distribution system, or you've got underlying disease, it's got to get into the arms of real people. And certainly today, you need the political will. Political will just doesn't mean, partisanship per se. It means a real, genuine public commitment. And you need resources, and you need continuity. You can't just have episodic. I mean, going back to the gun activity, then Senator Biden introduced legislation in 1994 banning military weapons, military grade weapons. I mean, let's be clear. I don't know what you need 30 rounds of a semi-automatic weapon to shoot a deer. I can understand maybe, on a gun range, but so then lock them up, rent them, use them for the day, but to take them home and to have them as automatic weapons doesn't make sense to me. Then there's issues about, what did I really learn in public health? Well, again, it goes back to evidence, make sure it's not chance, it's real evidence. Then it's got to be, not just statistically significant, it's got to be clinically significant. It's got to matter in people's lives. And then you have to be able to take it to scale in all of this. And for me, the whole issue of, and we use the word equity these days. I mean, there's a lot of those, and I like the word empowerment. And the difference for me is, equal meant, okay, the box was equal, but the little person couldn't still see, even though there was some equality. Equity, at least they all could see over, but empowerment meant there was no longer a fence. And I think that's where I'm coming from. This little picture over here, and I could blow these up, but this is the classic public health paradigm that I added something to. It's taken a while to sort of infiltrate, but the classic process of public health is asking three questions. What's the problem? And where's the evidence? But really understanding the nature of the problem and the nature of the problem in the community and how it affects people. And what solution make sense as a result of that. And then there is the issue of, which we rarely do, which is part of the ongoing nightmare and debates and solutions in this country. What happened? Did we implement a solution and did it work? You've got a responsibility with your patients at the one-on-one level or at the population level. Did it work? But I do think I added a new version. Some of these challenges have been going on for so long in this country that I added a component called roots. It goes back to my experience in the South Bronx. Those black and white pictures are contemporary. And these roots of poverty and homelessness have been going on, for many years in all of this. And it's hard not to, most of you, your careers are looking at microbes, and certainly microbes are back, right? SARS-CoV-2, we don't even remember that it's, the virus has a name, and it's frankly related to the cold virus families, that we have dismissed. But for me, the pandemic, and this is Latin for pandemic, and this is Greek for pandemic, has exposed underlying insidious, pervasive, chronic, whatever word you want to talk about, what I like to call are macrobes. Some of those underlying contextual malevolence. Another word for malevolence, and again, I would usually ask you, ideas on malevolence. Hate. How intense the things have become. Mendacities. Are there such things as alternative facts? Are there such things as two sets of facts? I even have trouble with the language that implies, well, there's fact A and fact B. No, there's facts, there's science, there's evidence. Now, science changes. We do know that over time in medicine, we were convinced that we treated, in children, we treated prematurity with high levels of oxygen and thought that was solving one problem, which it was, breathing and oxygenation, but it ended up creating blindness. So we learned through medicine, and the pandemic is a perfect example of what we thought one day, and with evidence, we've modified it and improved it. I think that's, to some degree, for some people, it's undermined some of their confidence because they interpreted change based upon new science as more uncertainty in all of this. I think the misery and the mental health anguish, not only from the isolation that we self-imposed, and even we're not together Saturday morning. There's still, the pandemic is still with us. The virus is still with us. So there's a sense of picking and choosing what you expose yourself to. What's the risk, even if it's gotten with immunizations and some mask wearing, and Daryl, as President Pines, has done a good job. But certainly the last one, the consequence of a monetary consequence, we're back to everything, whether it's inflation, and I just came back from seeing my grandchildren in California, $6.50 a gallon of gas. I didn't want to go anywhere. $6.50 a gallon of gas, bad enough it's 4 something plus here, but out there it was extraordinary. And 1 million people died in the United States, 15 times that worldwide. So there's costs, human capital costs, and I think it's exposed all of this, and it's certainly intensified our political divide. I mean, I'm not going to reiterate the non-science that came from the previous administration to to now, but it's just aggravated many things. So, again, one of my key characters in my life was Albert Einstein. Went to the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and some things to think about is that in the middle of every difficulty, there's an opportunity. I mean, we now have mRNA vaccines because we didn't handle AIDS properly, 20, 30 years ago. And I've worked with Tony Fauci and got to know Tony over the years. But until Tony, the community rose up and said, we're dying, so let's not do a traditional randomized controlled clinical trial that NIH was so focused on. We're dying. So AIDS set up, frankly, the advances in technology to have gotten the mRNA vaccine. It's sticking with things that matters. And again, subtle issues of success doesn't mean you got promoted, but did you make a difference? And sometimes curing one patient, taking care of one patient, sending one child home, smiling and happy. And certainly, and I'm proud of our university that imagination is certainly part of our curriculum. And I think I can't remember whether it's called Imagineering or Imagination Center or something that just got launched. But the last one is, my odyssey, and hopefully yours is going to help you perspective. Where you sit and what you see and how you see it matters. And bringing your experience together, it isn't just, through the microscope, although there's objective. And again, this issue of sticking with it. Many times in science, and I'm sure in your careers, in school, your experiments didn't quite work, but changing them. I mean, even if you look at the clinical trials, now Pfizer is, convinced themselves, and hopefully the rest of us, that 5 and under are going to be able to be treated. And it's 1/10 the adult dose. They had to play around with dose. They had to play around with the temporal sequence of when the vaccine should be delivered and how many, and and all of that. And then we start to get into perceptions, which sort of gets into values, how you perceive this issue: big problem, little problem, no problem. Do you perceive the Second Amendment as more important in the lives of children? And the last one are those 2 little kids. Hugs, passion, personal connection. Well, somehow or other, a whole hour seems to have gone by. No questions, few answers. So now let's see if we can have a conversation. You can unmute, all of you, yell questions. I've been looking at the chat. It's hard enough to manage 2 screens, let alone looking at the chat, but I can't imagine there aren't some, and there's no bad questions, obviously. Questions, comments, thoughts, reactions. Wow, was this good that there are no questions? Can't be.
Well, Dr. Kessel, I'll be hosting the Q&A session. So before I begin, though, I'd like to thank you for our mentorship and for your teaching.
Well, thank you, and thank you for all of that. And some of you, it's 11 o'clock. Some of you have to be waking up, 2nd, 3rd, 4th cup of coffee. There's no homework, right? You're all in either graduated or in between something or other. And I didn't know how this was exactly going to work, but Mohammed, however you want to handle the cues, have at it.
All right. So before I begin, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Mohammed Hamza Ahmed. I'm in a joint BSDO program with Seton Hill University and the Lake Erie College of Osteopathic Medicine out in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. And to start off the Q&A, the first question I like to ask is, why did you choose to go to medical school at Albert Einstein? You mentioned, admiring Einstein, you mentioned some of his quotes, but why specifically that school? Was there anything about the school specifically that attracted you there with your engineering background?
Well, Mohammed, the implication of the question is that it's a rational choice. Frankly, even in those days, I think I applied to 10. I think I got into the majority of those schools, or at least heard back from those schools. But Einstein, to be blunt, was the first one that said yes. And as I'm sure you are all been experienced with, it seemed like a good place. I didn't know anything about New York. I didn't know anything about Einstein. Was a relatively new school. Some of it is how the schools you put on your list. And Einstein was new, and it was and it came across as a socially conscious, enlightened school. But I didn't know much about all that. I was more or less an engineer. But I think I was at one of my events at Drexel and got a phone call, and it was the admissions officer, and they said, "Congratulations." And I said yes. So it was the first one that said yes. And then, I didn't think about it afterwards. There were schools in, certainly in Philadelphia that my parents wanted me to stay home, my community, whatever it all is. And fortunately it was a terrific decision, not just for my medical education, but for my social education. And little did I know that was going to be it. But would that there was some masterful calculus and brilliant, I wanted to study, some rare disease, and that was the epicenter of it. It was, to be blunt, it was the first place that said yes, and it was a great place, and I'm going.
Thank you for that answer. I actually have a really similar situation where Seton Hill was the first to accept me. And they were also the first to offer me positions in the BSDO program. So, from the very beginning, as I was getting accepted, it was slowly becoming the first school I decided to go with.
Well, we have that as a similar, kind of thing. I mean, some people agonize over the choice. I mean, I had, a few of my students, should I go to University of Maryland or should I go to Hopkins? And we'd have, ongoing conversation about cost and is there any difference in the medical education? Zero. And they're both in Baltimore, seeing similar population. So it's an interesting issue of choice. I mean, are there differences? Yeah. I mean, in the middle of the country, you see a different population mix. In urban inner city communities, you see different population mix. But not to prolong that question, but thank you. And thank you for sharing the honesty of the simplicity of press that button because they were the first, they wanted me, and thank you. And I'm in and didn't have to worry about it. When all the other letters came in, an interesting, subtle story that I should tell you. The president of Drexel sat on the board of Jefferson Medical School. And I think I'd gotten on the wait list at Jefferson. And the president of the university, who I knew, not as well as I know Daryl, but because we're common engineers in some ways, Daryl Pines at the University of Maryland, but Bill called me up and said, Woody, I want you to go to Jefferson. I'm on the board and we want some of our best students to go there. And so he arranges for an interview, and the interview was with the chairman of medicine. And I walk in, appropriately, and he says to me, and this is a little bit of a paraphrase, but pretty damn close. I walk in, well, it's chairman of medicine. And he says to me, what the hell makes you so damn special to waste my time to have to interview you? And I was a little surprised and startled. And I stood up and I said, well, and because I had been accepted to Einstein, I, had a little security in me, but I stood up and I said, well, I'm sorry, sir, that I'm wasting your time. And I will report back to my president how annoyed you are at having to have this this interview. And he freaked out because he knew damn well he had been directed by his president, and he was totally inappropriate. But and I went back and told the president, and he called them, and it became an issue, and I got accepted. And then he said, you can't turn down Jefferson, they blah, blah, blah. And I said, not gone to this place. And Jefferson's a first-class medical institution in Philadelphia. Anyway, that was one of my medical school admission stories. Got lots of stories.
Thank you for that answer. Now, our second question. Can physicians also practicing patients while working in the government? And were you able to see patients earlier in your career?
Yes, and that's critical and essential and important. Early in my career, when I had probably, I wouldn't call them fewer responsibilities, but responsibilities where I could manage them better, I would go to Children's Hospital in Washington here, not in uniform, and went as an attending and saw patients with medical students and residents, and it was terrific. I didn't do inpatient. I might do some rounds, but I didn't take on the responsibility. So I made that a point, and frankly, all of my supervisors who were equally physicians, a little biased, supported all of that. So yes, I did that for most of my career. It became harder later on because occasionally I have to testify on Capitol Hill. You were no longer completely in charge of your own time frame and calendar. The secretary would call some nightmare would happen. For example, I was the only physician in the building on 9/11 when the Twin Towers were attacked. And I went to the secretary's office and was there. We stayed there, didn't go home. We slept there. And my job was to call all of the medical facilities, particularly in New York, to see how we could be helpful. And as an aside, tragically, they didn't need as much help as we all had anticipated. There was either the number one reason for emergency room at that point in New York after the planes crashed into the towers was eye trauma, debris, flying debris. But the tragedy was you either died or the consequences were more long-term, breathing and other things. But my job was I called all the emergency rooms to see what needed to be mobilized and how we could respond. And, we found some weaknesses in the system. For example, it's interesting to report this, given the news with infant formula being compromised. They didn't stockpile infant formula. There had not been we stockpiles around the country in secret locations that are rotated, God forbid, for national emergencies. And this was a national emergency, but they had no infant formula. on board. Which really went to tell you there was no pediatrician on the advisory committees and no obstetricians. There was no, women's medical supplies either. And then I went to the secretary and I said, not only do we need infant formula, in this supply venue, but we need toys. If these children are going to be isolated and put in places, we need a ball. We need something. Don't look at me like, the first response is, well, that's not medical equipment. So yes, I was fortunate, and an obligation, of the United States Public Health Service is that you maintain your medical license. And in order for you to maintain your medical license, you got to see patients, and you have to do CME. Now, interestingly enough, the Public Health Service is the origins of some of that CME. So I could answer some of these questions as simple as yes, but I think all of the health professionals in the United States Public Health Service, civilian and non, feel obligated to fulfill the obligation of their clinical experiences and maintain that, and contribute at the one-on-one level as well. These are easy questions.
Thank you very much for that answer as well. A lot of people in the chat have been asking about humanitarian aid. Even I'm interested in doing humanitarian aid in the future. So I'd like to ask, what advice do you have for someone wanting to get into humanitarian work?
Well, the humanitarian need worldwide is intense. I've not traveled extensively, but I've been to several countries in Africa, particularly Sierra Leone, and just basic issues as potable water. Couldn't drink the water, and while there's water systems, the sewer systems, there's some classic public health issues, but there's humanitarian need, ongoing, simply as a consequence of growth and development in community, and particularly, medicine, potable water. One thing I've been involved with, which is a cross between humanitarian and medical, is something called Helping Babies Breathe. This is purely an activity, focused on pediatrics, but it's educating interested people globally that at birth, doing some simple interventions that we all can do. There's sort of a golden minute, golden hour, stimulation, resuscitation, and there's some training materials that are out there. That are there, but the basic necessities: food, water, antibiotics. I treated, folks when I was there out in the field, and some burns and some issues, but it's hard to separate out. I think one of the hard parts now is being clear about what you see as genuine organization. There's places called Doctors Without Borders, and which is a wonderful thing, and Jose Andres food pantries. But in many of our community-based, you sort of have to screen some of these places, because tragically in the world today, some of the community efforts, you send money and doesn't go where it's supposed to go. But the point that I want to make is, I came up over time with the word global, and that's my attempt at a portmanteau. A portmanteau takes two common words like hotel and motor vehicle, and you come up with a motel. But I came up with the word global because we used to call it international, then we called it developing countries, then we called it global. Global meant in our communities, there's challenges, there's homelessness, there's food insecurity. The University of Maryland has a food pantry. I mean, so some of the challenges that are there are local as well as they are, global. Not the sadness and tragedy of what the Ukrainians are going through, being bombarded and being murdered en masse and displaced and all of that. But there's strife all over this world. So check out some of the local advocacy organizations, and we can chat offline some of the ones. And again, depending upon whether you focus on children or adults, or folks coming to this country. But there's a lot to be able to do, and I think they would welcome all of your activity. And you can do things even from home, making calls, trying to organize things. You don't have to just get on an airplane and go to the front lines. But again, I guess my point being, we have global as well as we have local, which is global.
Thank you very much for that answer as well. I'll make sure to keep everything you said in mind for my own future. The next question we have is regarding, technology on future generations. So as you've seen the progression of exponential rise of technology, what are your thoughts on children being handed iPads and chronic screen time use?
Well, that's an interesting question. Sort of two parts. One is, children's exposure to screen time, what we call screen time. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has put out some guidelines for limits on screen time. Now, the dilemma with screen time, and I'm starting with that one first because I sit on the advisory board for Sesame Street. And what a privilege it's been to work with Sesame Street. I would go there, and I know what Big Bird eats, but I don't know what Elmo eats. Talk about good nutrition. But I was there, for example, at one meeting, and there's a term of art, something called linotype, which predates, and this is a technology answer, predates. Linotype is the size of the letters that they used to use for printing newspapers. And the biggest linotype came out, war declared, war over, and it was physically linotype, and it was usually 5-6 inches, almost took up the whole top half of the newspaper. And I stood up and I said, whoa, Sesame Street could get 6-inch linotype, the headline in the New York Times, Cookie Monster gives up cookies. This was around promoting good nutrition for children. And they were smarter than I was. They took that suggestion and translated it into cookies are sometimes food, and fruits and vegetables, color your vegetables, is an anytime food. So there's quality content, and then there's sort of, and I think the quality content for a lot of children's programming has got improved, but simply passive viewing is of concern, and there are studies done. And then we get into the non-quality programming. The whole issue of violence, on using the technology and using games and those kinds of things. So there's the quality issue, there's the purpose of it. Now look, COVID, parents need a break, and if you put your children with some of that technology, and it's quality technology, and a lot of it's gotten better. So there's still some ongoing issue about how much, how often. I'm sure all of you walk around with this. We're inseparable. Either we're bored, we look, oh, who sent what? Oh, did we get that? Is there a sale? Where are we going tonight? What are we going to eat? I used to teach from the back of the room when you all had your computers open, and buying stuff on Amazon, communicating, texting, all of that stuff. Technology has its place. But let me go to the other side. Sitting in the bioengineering department, and my background is in technology, as an electrical engineer. So I sort of see the benefits. But I've been a real champion, frankly, of trying to change some of the traditional technology and trying to rethink the breakthroughs. Is there breakthrough technology? Not just automating reading the electric cardiogram. There's some wonderful, new technology, reads itself, tells you what's going on, interprets it. But is that the best technology for assessing cardiac function? I think not. So technology is going to be critically important. I worry a little bit about telemedicine. I worry about, for me, hands-on, that last one about the hugs and the passion and the communication. We're going to have to find the balance. Don't necessarily need to go into the office for everything, but I think eye contact matters, and human experience matters, and how we do this. And Zoom has taught us some things. I think it's enabled a lot, but there's something missing from me being able to walk up to somebody in class and asking them a question, in all of that. But the last thing I want to say is about the gun violence. I've been a real proponent of something called smart guns. And for example, to oversimplify, the hour's getting late, you all have to go mow the lawn or do something. I think if we added simple technology that's in this thing, so that the users were limited. We have more technology in this phone about theft, identity, tracing. It even monitors my cardiogram, right? I just put my watch on and I don't even have to go to the cardiologist. But for example, the trigger on a handgun is about 3 to 5 pounds. Normally I would ask, what age do you think kids are strong enough to pull that trigger? Age 3, they can pull that trigger. Now the argument is you pull the trigger and you want accuracy because of competition. Well, okay, so have those firearms in a sporting facility, but change the pounds per square inch. More importantly, put a sensor on those weapons so it can't be fired at point blank range. Virtually 2/3 of the 45,000 deaths in the United States are related to suicide. Availability of the weapon. And they're all handguns. You can't use a long gun. But if we had the technology, it probably could stop a significant amount of it. So there's good parts of the technology, good content. We want to find that right balance, not just in terms of, streaming, stuff. We've all watched more movies than ever these days. But I think technology is going to help us, but I think we have to be certainly smart. And the hardest part today about technology is the First Amendment. How loud can you scream fire on social media, and the hate, and anyway, that'd be longer conversations.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Kessel. These are all the questions we have for today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kessel. We really appreciate you taking the time to answer all of our questions and taking the time out of your day to mentor us. And I'd love everyone to please give a warm thank you to Dr. Kessel in the chat box for this incredibly informative session. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all. And if there's some follow-up or, whatever, I'm happy to, work with you, call you, chat with you, drive you crazy individually, do whatever I can. So this was
Thank you.
terrific. And thank you for inviting me. Good luck with your careers. Good luck with the weekend. Be safe, be smart, be safe, be thoughtful. And frankly, I'm an old character, so I look forward to all of you solving, the myriad of the challenges that we face today. So again, thank you all.
Thank you. And yeah, it's true. Dr. Kessel has mentored many of my friends. They all talk about in such positive light. And truly, Dr. Kessel is here for you if you have any questions. You can Google his name and you can find his contact information online as well.
Absolutely. Good luck. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Now we're going to be conducting our closing session with our quiz and future session dates. So the link to the quiz for this session is now live. You'll need a 70% or higher to pass and receive certification for today's session. That is in the chat box now. And now on to our next session dates. These dates will also be posted throughout our social media outlets, so be sure to follow us at TeleShadowing. Our next session will be next Saturday, June 11th at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time with our physician mentoring us in ophthalmology. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending today's session. We hope to see you in upcoming sessions, and this concludes this week's shadowing session. Thank you.